The Great Flood and the Ark of Promise. The great door of the ark, a vast slab of gopher wood, was shut by a power far greater than our own. It was not by the hands of myself or my sons, but by the very hand of God himself, a divine seal. This silent and absolute act separated the world that was from the world that would soon come to be. Inside the sealed vessel, a strange and solemn twilight fell upon us all, creating a world entirely unto itself. The air was thick with the scent of fresh gopher wood and pitch, of clean hay, and the warm living breath of 1,000 creatures. For 7 long days, we waited in this sacred space, a week of profound, expectant, and unbroken silence. The number 7, the sacred number of divine completion, now marked the final countdown to the end of an entire age. We were living on the very edge of a promise, suspended between a condemned past and an unseen, uncertain future. Every creak of the timber was amplified in the waiting quiet, a constant reminder of our isolation and our purpose. Outside, the sun rose and set as it always had, a picture of deceptive normalcy for the unsuspecting world. People went about their daily lives, their laughter and arguments echoing in the valleys, their hearts still set on wickedness. They saw the colossal vessel on the plain as a monument to the folly of a supposedly mad old man. They had mocked our family for years, and these last 7 days of waiting were certainly no different for them. But inside the ark, my family and I lived in a completely different reality, separated by the wood and God's command. We were an isolated island of faith, adrift in a vast sea of blissful, defiant, and dangerous ignorance. We moved through our daily tasks, feeding the animals, checking our vast stores, and praying together with a quiet, shared solemnity. Every rustle of an animal in its stall, every soft word spoken was amplified in the profound and waiting quiet. We were utterly alone. Yet, we knew, with certainty, that we were not abandoned by the one who sealed us inside. Then, on the 7th and final day of our waiting, the promised event finally began its terrifying arrival. It was not the gentle patter of a welcome summer shower, but a single, heavy drop of water from the heavens. It struck the roof of the ark with a loud thud that echoed ominously through the entire wooden structure. Another heavy drop followed the first, and then another and another, establishing a slow and deliberate rhythm. The sound was like the measured footsteps of a vast, approaching army, a sound that promised an overwhelming force. The sky, once a familiar and comforting blue, began to turn a bruised, unsettling, metallic gray color. The clouds did not gather in a natural way. They simply coalesced, as if the very air was condensing into water. The drops became a relentless drumming, and the drumming soon became an earth-shaking roar that vibrated through our bones. The windows of heaven, the very floodgates of the firmament above, were suddenly and violently thrown open by God. It was a deluge completely unlike any other in the long and ancient memory of the now doomed earth. Rain fell not in gentle sheets, but in solid, crushing columns of water that seemed to have infinite weight. The sound was utterly deafening, a constant, overwhelming cataract that completely swallowed every other noise on the planet. And then, the very world beneath us broke apart with a terrifying and final groan that seemed to tear the planet. With a sound that shook the foundations of the earth, the springs of the great deep burst forth in fury. The world was not merely being flooded from above, it was being systematically unmade from deep down below. From deep cracks in the parched earth, from fissures in the mountain rock, colossal geysers erupted towards the sky. The orderly divisions of creation, the separation of the dry land and the vast seas, were collapsing into one another. It was the terrifying and unrestrained rebirth of chaos, undoing the very work of the first days of the world. Inside the ark, my family and I huddled closely together, our hearts pounding with the rhythm of the unfolding cataclysm. The floor beneath us began to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the surging power of the rising waters. The sounds were terrifying, the roar of the rain and the shriek of the geysers from the deep below. We heard the splintering crash of ancient trees being torn from their roots, and then a new sensation began. A deep, groaning shudder ran through the immense vessel, followed by a sudden and jarring lurch. There was a moment of grinding and scraping against the ground, and then a lift. A feeling of weightlessness. The ark was afloat, a powerful and living testament to God's precise instruction and my own unwavering obedience. It did not struggle against the violent current, it yielded to it, as it was designed not to sail, but to endure. We were borne up on the very waters of judgment that were destroying everything we had ever known and loved. From the single high window that God had commanded me to build, all we could see was a maelstrom. There was only grey water and the endless driving rain that obscured any possible view of the horizon. The familiar landscape was gone forever, replaced by a churning, violent, and completely unrecognizable global sea. The desperate cries of our former neighbors, the panicked bellows of animals caught helplessly in the terrifying deluge, all were swiftly silenced. They were swallowed without a trace by the overwhelming cataclysm, a final deafening silence falling over the world. We were utterly alone, preserved in the midst of the very instrument of destruction. For 40 days and for 40 nights, the downpour from the heavens was absolutely relentless and showed no signs of abating. The water rose with a terrifying and seemingly unstoppable speed, consuming every single feature of the land we once knew. What were once tall hills became fleeting islands, crowded with the last vestiges of perishing life before they too were submerged. The water kept rising, impartial and unceasing, swirling over the proud cities built by the line of Cain. Their towers of human achievement and arrogance dissolved into the murky depths without a trace of their existence. It climbed the slopes of the highest mountains, the ancient peaks that had stood as sentinels since the dawn of time. The scripture says the waters prevailed so mightily that all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The flood rose 15 cubits, more than 20 feet, above the very highest of the mountain peaks, ensuring total destruction. There was no refuge to be found, no high ground to climb, and absolutely no escape from the judgment. The entire globe was enveloped by the flood, returning to a state of watery chaos reminiscent of the world before creation, and everything that had the breath of life in its nostrils, everything that lived and moved on dry land, perished. Every human being who hadn't heeded the warning of God was wiped from the face of the earth. Every man, woman, and child who had chosen the path of violence and rebellion over the path of God was gone. The beasts of the field, the cattle, the birds, and every creature that crept upon the ground were all extinguished. Only I, Noah, was left, and those who were with me in the ark, preserved by His grace. The roaring symphony of destruction and judgment slowly and finally gave way to a completely new and unfamiliar sound. It was the sound of utter, profound silence, a quiet that covered the entire face of the planet. The rain ceased its assault, the deeps were stilled, but the water remained, an endless, unbroken, and empty ocean. For 150 long days, the waters prevailed upon the face of the earth without receding. We endured 5 long months of floating upon a silent global grave, a world washed clean by divine judgment. Inside the ark, a new rhythm was established, the rhythm of survival, the rhythm of waiting, and the rhythm of faith. Day after day, my family and I tended to our sacred charge, the precious remnant of God's beautiful creation. Our only certainty was the covenant God had made with us, a promise of preservation and a new beginning. The ark was more than a ship, it was a promise, floating in the silence waiting for the command of God.